Thank you for watching, liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing right now.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. So I'm Scott Maxwell. I'm the Mars rover driver team lead on the Mars Exploration Rover project at JPL, which sounds so much better than saying I'm a chauffeur for science. That's basically what I am. I'm here today to talk to you about Mars 3.0, which doesn't exist, but I figured the this and that 2.0 meme is pretty much played out, and so I just jump a generation and go to 3.0. I know it's kind of bad form to begin your talk with a digression, but I thought, I realized yesterday during one of the talks I was missing an opportunity to show you guys a picture that you as an audience are uniquely poised to appreciate. This is Victoria Crater at Meridiani Planum on Mars. This is a big crater, a prominent crater. It's about 800 meters across. That means you could take about 8 football fields, including their end zones, and lay them end to end, and they just span this crater. This is the scientific promised land of Mars. This is Victoria Crater at Meridiani Planum. And this is my friend's cat, Mango. Okay, so if you're not familiar with JPL, I'll give you a little bit of background about it. JPL is the NASA center that is most concerned basically with robotic space exploration, robotic deep space exploration. So we do some Earth orbiters and we do some things like that, but mostly our bread and butter work involves sending robots out beyond the Earth orbit into the solar system to explore places that nobody's ever been before. So every picture you've ever seen of Jupiter, every picture you've ever seen of Saturn, every picture you've ever seen of Neptune, until recently, pretty much every picture you'd ever seen of Mars came from a JPL flight project. Now, Mars is a particularly interesting to us because Mars is a place that Julius Caesar thought was a god. And it's really only, nobody seriously believed that for centuries, but it's really only very recently, in the span of a human lifetime, that we've begun to make this god into something much more interesting. We've begun to make it into a place. It's a place that we can go, even if right now we can only go there through our robotic proxies. And we can ask questions about that place. We can ask, did it have water in the past? We can ask, did life ever form there? If it did, what did it look like, and what happened to it? And if it didn't, why not? And what does that tell us about how prevalent life might be in the solar system? And we can ask, we've proved things about its climate. We know that Mars has undergone a radical climate change, that at one point in the past it had liquid water that flowed freely on the surface and stood on the surface for long periods of time. And that's not true anymore. And it had a thicker atmosphere that kept that water in, and that's not true anymore. And we live on a planet ourselves where we have a nice thick atmosphere that we like to breathe, we have water to drink, and could what happened to Mars happen to the Earth? For a billion years, Mars has just been a frozen, airless desert. And could that happen here? So by going to Mars, we can ask some of the most profound and important questions that it is possible to ask. Now, from a social media perspective, the exploration of Mars has had 2 main phases, and we're just kind of standing, I think, on the cusp of a third. The first of these phases, Mars 1.0, began in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when we sent the Mariner and Viking series of probes to Mars. This is a picture from Viking 1 lander, and this is an absolutely amazing picture. This is in the 1970s. This is 30 years ago. We had a robot on Mars with a digging arm that could dig up soil and put it in experiment chambers and run experiments on it, do chemistry on that soil, that could send us back color pictures from the surface of another planet all the way to here on Earth. In the 1970s, 30-year-old technology. And what happened to those images once they got to the Earth was they came to JPL, JPL took them, gave them to the mainstream media, and the mainstream media showed them to you, well, not you, Mark, but to most of you, until they figured probably pretty accurately that you were bored, and they moved on to the next thing. Well, what did you do if you were interested in what was going on with the Viking landers and what was being learned about Mars after the mainstream media correctly judged that most of your neighbors were bored? Well, there wasn't really a whole lot that you could do. There wasn't really a way for you to keep up on the mission. So that led to Mars 2.0. Mars 2.0 really started on July 4th, 1997, when the Mars Pathfinder probe landed on Mars and carried with it this little robot here called Sojourner. It's about the size of a microwave oven with 6 wheels. And continues, Mars 2.0 does, with the MER rovers, my own twin girls here, Spirit and Opportunity, who send us back images like these from the surface of Mars. And this kind of does the same thing. This picture, by the way, is from Spirit. Spirit has climbed a hill, the height of the Statue of Liberty, and is now standing on top of that hill from that perspective, looking around at the surface of Mars. And so we did the same thing with these images, of course. When the images came back to JPL, we took them, we gave it to the mainstream media put them out there. And I don't mean, by the way, in what I'm saying, to disparage the mainstream media, because they actually did a really good job of covering our mission. They were accurate, they were timely, and they kept us on the front page for 3 months, which is an awfully long time for them to pay attention to something that's not a sex scandal or a war. But nevertheless, in time, we too faded from the front pages, and they come back to us for anniversaries and so forth. But as a general thing, if you want to keep up with the mission, you would be out of luck, except for the distinguishing feature of Mars 2.0, which is, of course, the website. So if you want to keep up with the Mars rover mission, every image that comes from the rovers gets put on the website within hours of its receipt. You can keep up with the mission every day. And we use the website, too, to put up mission updates, to write feature stories about the rovers, to give you flight director updates, I think every week. And so this is a great way to keep up with the mission. You can keep on following the mission long after ABC and CNN and all those other fine organizations are no longer carrying us on a regular basis. And in fact, I've heard from some of you at this conference that you actually do that. You actually check in with the rovers. I found out recently that my dad's doctor checks in with them at least once a week. And another feature of Mars 2.0 was that communities formed around the rovers. Communities at places like unmannedspaceflight.com, which started out as a website whose intent was to track the progress of the Mars rovers, and has expanded to cover all kinds of unmanned spaceflight, so all the other JPL missions and other unmanned missions into the solar system. So what about Mars 3.0? Well, that's a good question. I don't know either. But Mars 3.0, I think, is just kind of starting because a whole lot of things have opened up and have become possible to do with the web in the 11 years since Pathfinder landed on Mars. And in about 20 minutes, when I'm done with the prepared part of my talk, I'm actually going to ask you to help me figure out what Mars 3.0 ought to look like, and with it, the future of space exploration. But in order to do that, there's some things I need to talk to you about first. In particular, I need to talk to you about, for starters, I need to talk to you about what I think Mars 3.0 kind of ought to look like. What I would like for Mars 3.0 to look like is that for future missions, like Mars Science Laboratory, this is a bigger, bolder rover we're sending to Mars, battery rover we're sending to Mars, where our rovers are about the size of a golf cart. This rover is about the size of a Mini Cooper. It has a laser on it that, whose official name is ChemCam, but I like to call it the Martian Death Ray. Because it can like zap holes in rocks, burn the rocks from a distance, and like measure what comes off of them and see if the rocks are interesting enough to drive over to and take a closer look. We've got missions coming up like Athlete. Athlete is, you can see if it stands up tall, it can kind of look over your head. And this, by the way, is a half-scale model made for Earth gravity. So the official version will be 2 or 3 times this size. And by the way, just as a side note, I've done some work on MSL, I've done some work on Athlete, and I realized, I kind of woke up about a year ago and realized that my day job involves driving a golf cart around on another planet while simultaneously planning the invasion of the moon by an army of 12-foot-tall metal robot spiders on roller skates. And I realized in that moment that I had grown up and stepped into my own fantasy world that I had when I was a kid, and I was now getting paid for it. Yeah. So for future missions like MSL and for Athlete, and maybe even for our own MER rovers, what I'd like to accomplish is I'd like to do something more. I'd like to take what we've done with this kind of one-way communication channel with our own website, and combine that with the two-way communications that are in these independently run websites like unmannedspaceflight.com to make something much better. But I want to be careful about what I don't mean this to be. I don't want it to be simply a two-way conversation. Okay? That's good. A two-way conversation is a good thing. I don't have anything against it. I like it that the Phoenix lander, for example, has a Twitter feed. And if you want to know more about what the Phoenix lander is up to, you can ask questions and you can get answers to those questions. I think that's great. But I really want to do something much bigger than that. I think back to when I was a kid, when I was growing up in an economically depressed area in rural eastern North Carolina. And it seemed to me like space exploration was about the coolest thing you could possibly do. But there was me, and there was an invisible wall, and then there was the people who did that. There's me, an invisible wall, and the people who do space exploration. And it wasn't even really until after I was working at JPL that I realized that that wall isn't there, but the fact that it was there almost kept me from going to the job interview. I thought, nah, that's something other people can do. Other people wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't be interested in me. They'd never want to hire me. I literally almost had to be pushed into going to the job interview. And what I'd really like Mars 3.0 to be is something that smashes that wall. I'd like it to be the case that any kid who has an interest and who wants to participate in the space program, any adult who has an interest and wants to participate in the space program can make a meaningful connection and a meaningful contribution to working on a real space project, just because they're interested and just because they're smart and just because they have a web browser. So, in order to help you help me and to make the questions I'm going to ask you about this make sense, I need to tell you three basic things. I need to talk to you about, first of all, I need to describe for you, kind of as an overview, no pun intended, a crash course, how we drive Mars rovers. Two, I need to talk to you about some of the practical and legal and contractual obstacles that we're going to have to kind of work around in order to make this happen. And three, I'm going to talk to you about one of the reasons why I think we should bother. So first, how it works. I'll give you an overview of how we drive the Mars rovers. Now this doesn't work like, driving the Mars rovers in particular doesn't work like you might think, where we have a joystick. Mark, have you ever seen one of these? It doesn't work where you have a joystick and you kind of push forward on the joystick and the rover goes, and you pull backward on the joystick and the rover stops. And the reason it doesn't work like that is light time delays. Okay? Dave thinks he has a problem with a 10-foot UI. We have a 10 light minute UI. It's a little bit of a different problem. For us, you push forward on the joystick and nothing happens for 10 minutes while the signal propagates to the rovers at the speed of light. Then the rovers start moving, but you don't know it because even if they start sending you data back right away telling you what they're doing, it's another 10 minutes before that signal returns to you. So there's, in the best case, when the planets are right next to each other, as close as they get, there's a 4 light minute delay. When they're on opposite sides of the sun, it's a 20 light minute delay. So just imagine trying to back your car out of your driveway with that, and you can understand, right? You can understand why we don't do that. So instead, we have what we call a daily tactical cycle of operations, okay, the tactical timeline. And that works like this. We take advantage of the fact that the rovers are solar powered, so when the sun goes down at night in the Martian sky, the rovers have to shut down anyway. So before they do that, they send us back pictures and other data that tell us about the world around them. They tell us what the world looks like, the lay of the land, the rover's own suspension articulation, kind of the state of everything they've been doing during the day. They record that and they send it back to us. And then the rovers go to sleep, and we go to work. So we work the Martian night shift. The images that the rovers send back come back in stereo pairs, and that means that we can turn them into a 3D model of the world around the rover. So now we have Mars, the video game, sitting on our desktop. And we can put a copy of the rover down in that world and drive it around inside of that simulation. So we can send commands to the rovers inside of this simulation, watch what they're going to do, and of course we can paint lines in it to show where the rover's tracks are going to go and all kinds of other useful information. Because it's a 3D world, we aren't limited in perspective. We can spin that world around, back away from it, look at it from all kinds of different angles, overlay it with a grid for scale, and all kinds of other information that help us understand what the rover will do in response to the commands that we're going to send it. And the tactical timeline has a lot to it. We get together in the morning, we get the data down from the rovers, we do a quick assessment of that data to look for any anomalies, to look at the rover's health and safety issues, to get a basic plan formulated for what we want to do for the day. And then we have a big meeting where we kind of sketch out a more detailed plan for what we want the rovers to do, kind of make sure that everything we have in mind fits within our time and energy budget. So for example, it might be we want to take some pictures and then drive, and do we have enough time to do both of those things in this day before we have to shut down for our compass and so forth. We then split apart out of that meeting and all go furiously work on implementing parts of that plan in parallel. So there's multiple different people in parallel working on different parts of the plan and translating them into the commands the rover's going to actually execute. We get back together for another meeting where we show each other kind of a first draft of what we're doing and make sure we're all on the same page and everybody's okay with it. We then split up again, do a whole bunch more refinement and implementation of that plan, breaking down everything into commands for the rover, making sure we're thinking about all these corner cases. Are we thinking about cases where if we drive off course, is the rover going to catch that correctly? Should we really go this way instead of that way around this rock? Making sure that everything we're putting into this, what we call a sequence that we're going to send to the rovers, correctly deals with all kinds of off-nominal contingencies. Those of you who are software developers, this is like writing typically around 500 to a couple thousand lines of code a day, where a single error costs $300,000 and maybe in fact sacrifices a priceless national space asset. And so then we get back together, look at everything that we're going to do, every single command we're going to send to the rover that day. We review that carefully, line by line, and the whole team takes a look at it and tries to make sure that we've poked at it properly and we aren't missing anything and we've taken care of, we've thought of every possible contingency. Then we run all that stuff through a whole bunch of software tools and then get back together again, do a second review. So every command we're going to send to the rover, at this point we've looked at twice. And if we still can't find anything wrong with it, and we take all the commands that made the simulation do the right thing, and we send them up to the rover, and we go home and go to sleep. That's one day. The rover gets its commands. The sun comes up in the Martian sky. The rover receives its commands, executes them through the course of the day, and then the sun goes down in the Martian sky. The rover sends us back pictures and other data telling us what it actually did, which on a good day looks like the simulation. But then again, every day the pictures are right side up is a good day. And then the rover goes to sleep and we go back to work. So that's kind of one day, one tactical cycle of operations. Okay. In addition to that, okay, so we've got that going on every single day, that cycle going on every single day. In addition to that, at the same time, you have to recognize that that does not leave us time for any kind of longer scale planning because you're working just furiously from the minute you get there to the minute you leave. And so there are other important questions that we answer on what we call the strategic timeline. And that takes a look at things like, do we want to explore the area to the east or the area to the west? Does orbital imagery show us we're going to get better science over there or over there? When we get to that crater that we're going to go to the east, should we go around it clockwise or counterclockwise? And the strategic timeline also often looks back. It looks back at things like, in this area, how has the rover been slipping as it's been interacting with soil, and what does that tell us about where we want to go from here? So we've got that strategic timeline going on at cycles of weeks, months, a longer scale like that. And the tactical stuff feeds into the strategic stuff, and the strategic stuff feeds back into the tactical stuff. Now, as complicated as this is just the way we do Mars rover operations. It's not the only way that spacecraft operations works. There are other styles of doing it for other spacecraft. For example, for orbiters or for like a Saturn orbiter for something like that. You can do this very differently. You can plan weeks in advance because you know where the moons of Saturn are going to be weeks from now, and you can kind of plan on those time scales instead. So everything they do for our purposes is on the strategic timeline. The rovers are very different from that and are a special case, but it's the case I know best, so it's the case I wanted to tell you about. So that's a kind of basic overview of how Mars rover operations works. And now I should tell you about some of the obstacles in the way of doing something where we really involve and engage the public. And these are fairly significant, I have to tell you. The first is that under the law, every spacecraft is a weapons system. And that means that every spacecraft falls under the regulation of something called the ITAR regulations, the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations. There are certain technical details of how the rovers work that I can't tell you any more than if I worked on the Patriot missile system, I could tell you details about how that works. If I do, if I told you the names of the commands we use to drive the rovers, tomorrow I'm in federal prison. And as you can imagine, the downsides being so great, this creates a lot of fear and kind of uncertainty around what we can and what we can't share with the public, and therefore a lot of resistance about sharing technical data. And so that makes it hard for us to engage with members of the public in ways that would require them to make technical judgments about what the rover can do. In fact, this problem is so bad that we can't talk often to our own international partners on this mission about some of the things that we do. We have instruments, science instruments on board the rover that were contributed by our international partners, and we can't tell those international partners the names of the commands we use to drive the rover. Okay? It's kind of an irritating problem. The second problem is something called scientific embargo. Do you know what this is? Anybody familiar with this? Okay. The idea is that if you are an academic, you make your living by publishing papers. And so you do experiments, you get scientific results, you write that up in a paper, and then you publish that. And that's kind of how you advance your career. So, what we do is we have a lot of scientists who work on the mission with us, and we ask them to invest years of their lives in working with us on the mission, and during which time they're putting in a lot of time and not actually able to generate a lot of results. So when the science results come back from the rovers, we give that data to them, we give them exclusive access to that data for a limited period of time. Eventually it all becomes public, but for a limited period of time, 6 months or longer, it's theirs to do with alone. So they get to write the papers on that and actually get to reap the benefits of investing all the time in us that they invested. And this is a good system given the way the academic system works. It's a fair deal. But it does mean, for example, that we can't take the science results that come back from the rovers, give them to you, and ask you what you think. At least we can't do that without a significant time delay. And third, there's simply the pressing matter of time. In any given day, we've got to get data from the rovers, we've got to analyze it, we've got to make a plan, we've got to implement that plan, we've got to go home. And we don't really have time in that process to go, hey, what do you think? So it's just a question of time. So we at least for driving the rovers, can't really engage the public in a meaningful way on the tactical timeline. At least I don't think so. So that sounds like a problem. Those all sound like a bunch of problems. But there's a saying at JPL, which is, if it doesn't look impossible, we're not interested. And so fortunately, this looks impossible. Great, awesome, that means we're interested. Okay. So third, before we get around to asking the questions and kind of engaging a discussion here, I'd like to talk to you about one of the reasons why I think we should bother to try. We sent the rovers to Mars to find evidence of past liquid water on the Martian surface. And both rovers found that. Both rovers found evidence of rocks that have been altered by long-term water exposure in the Martian past. So we know that Mars is very different than it was today. Opportunity found that evidence literally almost the moment she opened her eyes. Closer to her than I am to the back of this room, there was this beautiful stretch of rocks showing sedimentary layers, and indeed she got up, rolled right over to them, did some scientific exploration there, and sure enough found that in those rocks, embedded in those rocks, was excellent evidence of past liquid water. Spirit took a lot longer to find her good evidence, but she eventually found it starting at this rock here, Clovis, that she found as she started climbing that hill that I showed you that perspective from the top of that hill before. So the rovers are geologists. This is what they do. They kind of look at the ground, they look at their feet, they look at what's there because they're trying to read the story of the Martian past, and that story is written in Martian rocks. But the rovers don't spend all of their time looking down. Every once in a while, just like you and I should from time to time, they take a moment to look up. And what they see when they look up has just been absolutely amazing. They've seen the sunset over the far rim of Gusev Crater. Notice how much smaller the sun is there? They've seen the stars at night. That's Orion's belt, kind of down there at the bottom, and that prominent star in the upper section is Betelgeuse. They've looked at the stars. They've seen one of Mars' moons, Deimos, transit the sun. They did the same thing with one of Mars' other moon, Phobos. You'll notice that Phobos is a lot bigger, at least its apparent size. But more than that, they've seen Phobos going to eclipse, a Martian eclipse. So Spirit, here she's, over 7 times her design lifetime on the surface of Mars, waking up at night, struggling awake at night, to look up in the sky and watch a moon go into eclipse on another planet. Let's watch that again. Even more exciting than that to me, they've seen quarter-mile tall dust devils screaming at 50 miles an hour across the plains near the base of Husband Hill. They've seen wispy water ice clouds scudding slowly across the sky at Meridiani Planum. But for my money, the most profound image the rovers have sent back, and they've sent us back over 200,000 images so far and still counting. For my money, the most profound image the rovers have ever sent back is this one right here. You know why? That's the Earth. That's the first picture ever taken of the Earth from the surface of another world, right there. I think this is just a terrific image. And one of the reasons for that is it puts everything in perspective. This is our house as seen from the front porch of our neighbor's house. It's just this tiny speck of light in the sky. All of you, everyone you love, everyone you've ever heard about, all the kings, all the nations, all the wars, they've all taken place on this speck of light right here, what Carl Sagan called a pale blue dot. Some people find that to be a depressing idea because it makes our accomplishments seem small, but I don't agree with that. I think that this is a terrific, terrific image, a great thing to see, because if it makes our accomplishments seem small, it reminds us that our problems are small too, no matter how big they may seem. They're just as small. And more important than that, it reminds us that there's a great, big, beautiful universe out there just waiting for us to come and explore it. Come with me. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so in the spirit of Gnome Decks, your turn. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about the rovers generally. I'm sorry, I wasn't really keeping track of time, so I don't know how much time we have. 15 minutes? Okay, good. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have about the rovers, but in particular, if you can speak to any of these things, I'd like to hear from you, either here or at my email address here. You can reach me at gnomedex2008@scottmaxwell.org. The Mars rover homepage, of course, is marsrovers.jpl.nasa.gov, and I am, just as of yesterday, a Twitterer. I'm a member of the Twitterati and Mars rover driver there. So questions I have are about the kook problem. Basically, how do we improve the signal-to-noise ratio so that people who are on about the face on Mars don't make it impossible for everybody else to get through and actually do something meaningful? How we can scale this. We have very small teams who are chronically underfunded, and having some kind of way to filter out good suggestions or good contributions from the bad contributions would be very useful to us. Selling it. Ideas about how to sell the idea of public participation internally to NASA, a notoriously conservative organization, would be great. Reward structures, how we can make people feel useful but not used, would be very helpful. And what am I not thinking of? What problems have I not thought about and ought to be looking into? I have the ear of people within JPL who do this stuff, who do our website, have good connections with them, and I have a meeting with some of them next week. So anything you have to tell me would be very useful. I'd very much appreciate it. So any questions you want to ask, though, if you don't want to speak to those, you just want to ask a question about the project, that's cool, too.
I just have a very simple question, and I'm not sure if you addressed it. First of all, great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
How far do you move it every day? And I'm sure it changes from project to project, but I'm curious as to, on an average day when it stays upright and things go well, how far do you move it?
The question is, how far do we drive in a day? First of all, the line about any day the pictures are right side up is a good day is because if the rovers fall over on the back, they have no way to get back up. So just in case that wasn't clear to anybody, if that happened, that would be much worse than you would think. The farthest we've ever driven the rovers in a day, we drove Opportunity about 220 meters. Record holder, thank you. Spirit, we drove about 125 meters. Record holder, thank you. Both sides of the planet, world record holder, thank you. that's our max, typical a typical drive is probably in the neighborhood of like 10 or 20 meters in a sol, but there's a large standard deviation. Yeah.
Hi. In the software world, there's the idea of like with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow kind of thing.
I'm sorry?
With enough eyes, all bugs are shallow.
Yes, all bugs are shallow, right.
So with like this really important code you're writing every day, kind of a big deal. But if you can't share the actual commands, that makes it a challenge to share. Is there any possibility of sharing an analog or an interpretation or a simplification of the commands, or just the results of a simulation, that people look at, or some sort of analog to the set?
Basically, you're asking, could we, if we can't show you the real command name, could we show you these other command names and like do some kind of translation? That's a possibility. Theoretically, I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be okay. And in fact, when we write papers and we put the papers out there, for concreteness, you often have to give examples, and we do pretty much that. So we give, we'll name a command, move to or something like that, which isn't its real name. So that's a possibility that we could sort of give everybody else in the world a sort of phony language that we could translate one for one to the real language. I've had some trouble selling that idea myself, but it's something I'm going to continue pursuing, so I hope so. A visualization? One of the ideas that I've had that I haven't really had time to work on is something similar to that, where we would have a kind of like a video game that would run in your browser that you can kind of get practice driving a rover around within your browser and develop the skills even though you don't have the actual command set, so that you could take you through levels so that you could build up a skill where it starts off with just you're here and you've got a rock over there and it's just a question of getting there. And then there are more obstacles, and then you have hardware failures, and then halfway through your planning time, the scientists change their mind. Oh, that never happens. That kind of thing. And that would kind of be useful, I think, in conjunction with a sort of phony command set, right? You could actually have people kind of build up their skills and have a simulator in which they could do that. So yeah, so maybe.
It seems like a lot, when I read about NASA stuff, there's a time when things get shut down, even though they're working perfectly well, or seemingly perfectly well. Is that planned to happen? And if so, is there any way to not be doing that?
Well, let me tell you a story. Earlier this year, there was some talk about shutting down one of the rovers, doing some cost cuts for the MER project that would require us to shut down one of the rovers, even though, by the way, both rovers are still functioning and still doing science on Mars 4.5 years into their 90-day mission. So this idea did not meet with the greatest of enthusiasm, and the person who proposed that idea no longer works for NASA, and we have been assured by his replacement that both rovers will continue to be fully funded as long as they're still doing science. So I don't think that we face that threat, but the projects, the program overall does face that threat, and there's some reason for that. When you're doing these projects, it's really hard to estimate how much they're going to cost, because by definition, we're trying to solve problems nobody's ever tried to solve before. And it's hard to estimate in advance how much money that's going to cost. And so projects have cost overruns, and when they have cost overruns on a limited budget, something has to get cut. And sometimes that means cutting an older mission whose marginal return is no longer worth it when you compare it to the potential of a new mission. So it's not that those trade-offs are unreasonable, and if you want to see them stop being made, then you write your congressman. Yeah.
Hi, Scott.
Hey, Angel.
So I had essentially two questions from from our conversation. One was, I guess, an observation, which is that the amount of feedback that you're going to get, not only do you need a filtering system, but you need a way to categorize the data and snippets that people are going to send you, not only in terms of actual real data, but in actual comments, so that way you guys can pull them back. Because if you guys are limited in time as far as implementing, you don't want to have this huge filtering problem.
Right.
And I'm not sure that there, at least I don't know of, and maybe this is definitely the audience that does know of it, if it exists, of a good filtering tool that will take lots and lots of text data or numbering data and allow you to tag just segments of it instead of the whole thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, auto-categorization. one possibility that had occurred to me was setting up something like a Yahoo Answers type system where people are going to basically categorize it themselves because they're answering a question that you're asking, and so all the things that are related to that are under one thing. Another is a Slashdot style moderation system. So you've got topics, and you've got people kind of doing the ranking for you. It's easy to abuse those things, and so I'm not really sure that those things would work, but that's a possibility. But the idea of doing it automatically hadn't actually occurred to me. Just have people, have kind of a suggestion box and kind of automatically mine that suggestion box when you have a problem. That's a good idea. And
the other thing was too that, and I think it's implied, but what's great about this is if this kind of feedback can work, with Rover, it can work with lots of things that NASA is doing. I think that to me is, not being able to drive around 12-foot tall spiders, directly as a geek, I think it's very appealing to work on other things in NASA, even from just a suggestion standpoint. So I think it's super cool.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi, Scott. Over here, to your right.
Ah,
hey.
Howdy.
So, do you know what is definitely causing the rovers to extend beyond their 90-day lifespan yet, and how has that affected your mission planning going forward for Mars for the other projects?
Yes. Okay. So there are a couple reasons for that. One of them is that when you're taking $825 million of somebody else's money and you're promising them 90 days on another planet, you make damn well sure you're going to deliver. So that was the problem we were faced with, and we kind of built the rovers to be able to survive in the worst case scenarios that we could envision, so that even in the worst case scenario, we'd still deliver on our 90 days. But then when you actually get there and you don't end up facing the worst case scenario, then a lot of that work that you did for the sake of the worst case scenario turns into extended lifetime instead. That's one factor. Another factor is the particular thing that we thought was going to limit the rover's lifespan was dust deposition on the solar panels. So we knew from previous missions about the approximate rate of dust deposition on Mars, and we knew about what level of dust deposition it would take to completely block the solar panels, or completely enough that rovers would no longer be able to survive. And what we didn't count on was something that we hadn't seen in previous missions, which is the wind coming along and blowing dust back off the solar panels, and thus helping to extend the rover's lifespan. There was one period when Spirit was climbing that hill, Husband Hill. She was partway up that hill, and a really strong gust of wind. She had a couple of cleaning events in a row. And for a while there, this is around Sol 300 or so. So she's around 3 or 4 times into her design lifetime. And she was getting more energy then than she was the day she landed. The solar panels were that clean, and she had a more favorable tilt toward the sun. So that's been a really helpful factor for us on Mars. And now that some of those same features are working against us, because those windstorms also can turn into dust storms, and those nearly killed the rovers earlier this year and have put a lot of dust on Spirit's solar panels, so that she's something like 70% of the light that would ordinarily reach her solar panels is blocked by dust these days. And she's back in an area, thank you, she's back in an area where she's likely to get a lot less wind, so we kind of are going to have to kind of keep our fingers crossed for her that she's going to have a little better luck. And by the way, Ben, you saw that image earlier, the lolcat. Can you put that up on your damn site already? My friend submitted that like months ago. Okay.
This is one of those things where I'm going to sound like a real idiot because you thought of it 10 months ago, but why not put windshield wipers on the solar panels?
Okay, I get it's not a dumb question. We get that question all the time, and in fact, we consider doing systems just like that with windshield wipers and compressed air and stuff like that. There's kind of a couple reasons why those systems have problems. One of them is the dust on Mars. Mars has been doing it's had nothing to do for the last billion years but sit around and make finer and finer dust particles, and it's been really busy doing that. And so the dust blows around a lot. It gets triboelectrically charged, so it's basically a lot of static electricity. And it really wants to stick to those solar panels once it's on there. It takes pretty strong wind to blow it off. And so if you try to run windshield wipers over that, then what happens is you smear this really fine dust across your solar panels and leave big scratches that actually can make the situation worse than if you hadn't done anything at all. And secondly, any system you want to send up on board the rovers that can do something like that can somehow get the dust off the solar panels, itself has mass and volume. And we were really, really constrained on our mass and volume. If I had a little more time, I'd tell you one of the stories behind that. But But the short version is we basically had this trade where we knew we could survive 90 days without that, or had a really good probability of surviving 90 days without that. And if we put a system on there to clean the solar panels, we'd have to give up a scientific instrument. And so we decided to make the trade that we could meet our mission success criteria and get more science if we didn't try to solve that problem. And as it turns out, we got lucky. We got to some extent, we just got lucky. We got the best of both worlds. So we got all the science instruments on board the rover we wanted to put there, and we got this extended lifetime that kind of came along for free. So not a dumb question at all. Yeah?
So
Sorry, he shouted louder.
That's all right. You didn't disappoint per our conversation at lunch yesterday.
Oh, thank you.
As you probably saw by the second standing ovation in OMEX history.
Thank you.
The question I didn't bring up yesterday at lunch, which is, do you think the advances in solar technology, especially what's being done at MIT in terms of the flexible solar panels and what have you, will have a dramatic impact on your ability to generate power in environments like the moon and on Mars, and thus increasing the things you guys can do versus the current generation capabilities you guys have now?
Yeah, that would be great. We take any advances like that we can get. I'm not really sure, because I'm a software guy, not a hardware guy, what it takes to get those advances space qualified. But certainly anything we can do to generate more power is good. So yeah, if you can give me more energy, I'll take it. And it's a particular problem for us because, of course, the farther you get from the sun, the energy input falls off as r squared. So the rovers get a lot less energy at the orbit of Mars than they would here on Earth. So it's a problem as you go deeper in the solar system. And there are other ways to solve those problems. Carrying around a hot rock with you is one of them. But for any mission that wants to have solar input, anything we can do to get even a few more percent out of the solar panels is very welcome. Okay, sorry, last question, I'm told?
So I've been following the rovers for years, and just awesome science. And
Thank
I've
you.
had this idea for forever, dealing with the actual dust. How about clear, really thin, peelable plastic sheets that you could kind of tear off?
Yeah, it's a maybe. Again, any system we put on there has to be able to pay for itself, right? In terms of mass and complexity, it requires testing, it requires development costs, and so forth. And as far as I know, they haven't looked at any particular system that they've really liked. But I know that system's been proposed before, and I'm sure it'll get consideration. I'm sorry, I'm told that's the last question, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. I'll be around for the rest of the day, and of course, GNOMEDEX 2008 at scottmaxwell.org. Thank you guys very much.